they see the number of controls in that required baseline and they backpedal pretty quick. Oh, no. We're moderate, right? Because the
I see that all the time. It's like, oh, I'm not high anymore. I'm low. I'm medium, because that's a lot of work to be high.
Every day it checks against my rules and tells me what's not compliant. And now I can, when I see that EC2 instance with a public IP, I can stop it, remediate it, spin up a new one that's private, right? It's like, if we could do that in all 106 subcategories of the cybersecurity framework, right? Like it's not always this easy, but I think that's the kind of the spirit of what I'm trying to do across my security controls.
They're taking that CNA piece, that certification and accreditation piece, away from the paper pushers and bring it into the people who have to defend it. But in the paper, we just say, oh, you're out of baseline, let's disconnect you, right? That may work in commercial land, but it's not going to work in military warfighter land.
It doesn't work in commercial, man, right? We got to balance, protect, and enable. How far have we come? How far do we need to go? What do you want to see changing going forward to be doing this continuous assessment in a better way and more aligned to what this CSRMC is all about? Have you been following these headlines? Pentagon official details DoD's plan to blow up RMF. Department of War announces Cybersecurity Risk Management Construct. This is big news for cyber practitioners and job seekers, whether you're in the government or the large commercial ecosystem that supports it. Even if your company is nowhere near the government supply chain, this is a helpful topic to get up to speed on because federal is the big leagues. It often sets the high watermark standard that commercial industry cyber programs aspire towards. So here's what's replacing RMF for the Department of War, the Cybersecurity Risk Management Construct, CSRMC. I had tons of questions when I first saw this thing. For starters, what's going to happen with all these other agencies? Are they going to adopt CSRMC too, or does RMF stick around? What about all the NIST guidance that I'm a big fan of in this wheel here of the RMF steps? This stuff is accessible, detailed, high quality. How does CSRMC impact its evolution? Watching this transition is fascinating. I've got a boatload more questions, so I called a lifeline to help answer them. We are very lucky today to have someone who's lived and breathed RMF from every angle. The Navy, US Cyber Command, NSA, been a deputy CISO. He's also helped 2.5 million students upskill for cyber through Dion training. You might recognize him. He's now Chief Product Officer at AKYLADE. Jason, thanks so much for answering my civilian call. How are you?
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Man, I'm so excited to unpack with you what's different with CSRMC, why we should care. This is all kind of very new. I want to ask my favorite question of, so what's next with this thing, right?
Yep.
And I think even before we get into what this is, I want to start at the 30,000-foot view with every time a new framework arrives on the scene, I'm very skeptical. And in fact, I've got a golf club analogy about that, right? Are you a golfer? I know you live where there's golf.
Yeah, so I'm not a big golfer. I've been a couple of times as a former Navy officer. We do like to golf, or they like to golf, and I like to drive the little car around. So I would always play the driver and let them all go golfing. But there are lots of golf courses in Florida near me. I've got access to a bunch. I just never really go myself. But I do understand the analogy based on what I'm seeing on the screen here.
Okay, yeah, like we'll see if we, if I'm on the right track here. It's just like every time I see something like this, I think about the golf club industry. They've convinced millions of golfers that they're not good at golf because they haven't bought the latest driver. And they want to sell you a new driver every year. But what most golfers actually need isn't a better driver, it's a swing coach, someone who helps them understand the fundamentals. But that's harder to deal with because now you got to put in the work and the time to get a better swing. You can't just buy it off the shelf. So I think that's the analogy I think of for a new framework. Do you think that we're going too quickly to buy a new framework when what we really need is better implementation?
In this case, I don't. I think the framework has been broken for a long time, but our RMF is always snapshot type of component, right? In fact, back when I was working with the Navy, 2016, 2018 timeframe, I was working at Fleet Cyber Command on the cyber defense area. And one of the areas I was in charge of was creating a new program called the Continuous Hardening and Monitoring Program, which we called CHAMP. And the whole process of it was we wanted this automated way to check our status, because the way things were being done back then, almost 10 years ago now, 9 years ago, was we would do an RMF, we would do a snapshot in time, we would do an ATO, or an authority to operate, and every year you'd get inspected. But I can get inspected today, and then 3 weeks from now have a hack, because there's a new vulnerability that got released 2 weeks from now. And you wouldn't know that for another year, right? And so that was one of the problems. So one of the frameworks that I had built was this thing called CHAMP, which involved continuous monitoring, using systems to do that continuous monitoring, not just people in the checklist, which RMF is very checklist heavy, and all of that kind of continuousness to it, because we under the current system, if you go into the old CNA process, the certification and accreditation process, you would go through this whole long process, this whole big paperwork drill, and then somebody would say, okay, Omni Domini, stamp, you are approved. You are now allowed to turn that system on and connect it to the network. And that was called your IATO, or Interim Authority to Operate. And you could have that for up to a year. And then you can get permission for an ATO, which is good for 3 years. Do systems change a lot in 3 years, Steve? I think they do. I think the vulnerabilities do, right? And that was the big flaw that I saw in this all the way back 10 years ago. By the time we released it, was 9 years ago for this continuous hardening framework. And that's kind of the direction I see this CSRMC going, to get away from the point and snapshot time to a continuous way of looking at things, plus an automated way of looking at things, so we can do things quicker, faster, and more efficiently. Because if I have to have Steve go inspect that network, even if he did it once a day, he'd never get to the whole network. He'd have to do it once a week or once a month. But a system that does scans can do that continuously and notify it and let us know that there's issues. So that part of it makes me very hopeful. A lot of it is probably, lipstick on a pig, for lack of a better term, right? Because it's taking a lot of the RMF and it's taking those phases and regrouping them and reusing them. And we go from 7 steps down to 5 steps. But a lot of that is just combinations, right? It reminds me kind of the TCP/IP versus the OSI model, right? OSI is the generic model that works everywhere, and it's got 7 steps. TCP has 4 steps. But you could map the 7 steps into the 4 steps perfectly, right? And I think that's a lot of what you're going to see here with RMF going into CSRMC.
Yeah, exactly, man. A lot resonates there that I'm going to hit in a few moments, and I think it's easier said than done. And then there's the implementation of applying the checklist, and then there's actually what's on the checklist. So I think a lot to unpack that we will dive deeper into. Before we go much deeper, I want to stay. So we are at 30,000 foot. Any framework changes, we come in skeptical. I want to go to maybe the 10,000 foot view. Surface level first impressions. I mean, you've given some. I want to show you a couple small things that struck me. So for one, nitpick. Okay, cybersecurity is 2 words now. Come on, I thought we'd solve that with SF, and it was 1 word, but that's fine. We got an acronym collision. Okay, lots of acronyms in cyber, but I think of indicator of compromise, and now we've got initial operating capability. Okay, not a problem. Okay. Now
so
we've got
for that
something.
One, Steve,
go ahead.
I'll pause you for just 1 second, though. So IOC was actually around before indicator of compromise. So IOC is something we've been using in the military for about 70 years, right?
Kudos.
Like the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So our IOC in cyber kind of took over the IOC, because IOC and FOC is the initial operating capability and the final operating capability, or fielded operating capability, or whatever you want to call it, right? But that is something like when we're building a new weapon system, like a tank or a missile, we say, okay, here's our beta. Here's our, we go from alpha to beta. The beta is IOC, right? It's your initial operating capability. And then we go into your full operational capability. So anyway, sorry.
Isn't that funny?
Lots of acronyms.
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear so much grumbling, right? But to have that history and context, that's pretty fascinating. So that's just like a trivia piece. Now we've got something material, the word resilience, right? So that's something that you've been advocating for, putting it on your first textbook and your first cert with AKYLADE. And so first question here, how much of the CSRMC reform and change is due to people reading your book? And also, what were some of your other first impressions when you saw this for the first time?
Yeah, so, I don't think it was based on my book. I wish it was. I wish I was that cool, but I don't think it is. As you know, in my background, I worked at the National Security Agency, and a lot of these things come from the National Security Agency, specifically what we used to call the IAD, or Information Assurance Directorate, which is the area I worked in. And we've been trying to make this change from cyber security into cyber resilience for about 10 years as well, right? I started working with the NSA back in 2012, 2013, so about 12, 13 years ago. And so that was one of those big shifts that was happening around the 2014, 2015 part. When I got out of the military and the government workspace and started working with AKYLADE, and we wrote the book, that was 2023. So it had already been 10 years that we had been talking about this word cyber resilience, but it hadn't hit the mainstream yet. And so I kind of brought that with me to try to push that into the mainstream. And so if I saw this in commercial usage, I'd say, hey, maybe we had some effect. But because it's another military type document, which does come from national security agencies' input, I think it's probably more their doing than my doing. Especially on say it's my doing. I don't think it is.
Very good. Well, thanks, Jason. I think that's helpful. I'm going to show you now a kind of a mind map that I've put together comparing CSRMC to RMF. I'm going to flip over there now. I'll see you in a second. All right, Jason, here it is. Boom, solved in a one-pager. It's an eye chart.
My vision's pretty good, but I don't think it's that good, Steve. We might have to zoom in.
I wanted to start here just to give an appreciation for how much is going on. And, there's these clusters of themes that are very common in GRC and in cyber that are not new. And it's kind of fascinating to see at that forest level. I'm going to zoom in. Basically, my objective here with you is kind of have a mentor meeting. If you can check my blind spots, this is how we only have the 2 PDF documents and a press release. We don't have a 300-page special publication, right? But even at this preliminary phase, wrapping our heads around what's changing, I want to share my understanding and see what you think. Sound right?
Yeah, it sounds good. And I think that's a really good point you just made, right? Normally, when these things are announced, they also bring out the publication with it, right? So if you look at RMF, it's, really big, long document, plus another big, long document with all the sets of controls. So you add those together, it's 500 to 1,000 pages, right? With CSRMC, what we have right now is a 1-page press release, a 1-page PDF, and another 1-page PDF. That's what I've seen official sources. Because in preparation for this meeting, I wanted to go read the document so I could see, this is better, this is worse. But all we have is really that 50,000 foot view, that 30,000 foot view at this point. I think you've done a great job of digging into it as much as we can. But I think as more documentation comes out, we'll be able to dig in deeper. But this is a great way to get introduced to it. And I think this is also important to realize because, if the question comes, implement this, well, nobody today, because you can't until you have the book that tells you how to do it, right? Or the instructions on how to do it. So go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, right on. Well, and so in mapping all of the steps of all of the phases of RMF, or all the tasks from the steps, everything mapped, okay? There wasn't anything, there were a couple of things that you might put into a prerequisite phase, but it was a pretty close mapping. And I think, you have lived and breathed RMF and its kind of bureaucratic challenges, and that's kind of informed your opinion of it. I think that depending on how that's how it works in practice. But it's like this, it reminds me of this quote: in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is, right? Like there is an interpretation of RMF where you could have been doing things in a continuous monitoring fashion. And in fact, it dates back to about 2011 with that guidance. It's just, it didn't really make it there in practice. But anyways, starting off, in this phase 1, I think it's about step 1, capability need identified. So, right, I've got a BIA. I know my mission or business focused. I know my assets. I'm going to go to FIPS 199 and categorize it as a low, moderate, or high, depending on the needs that are of security objectives, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I've got elevating what was RMF initially at a maybe in the weeds system by system level to an enterprise level. We're going to have a risk register and a perspective that cyber is a boardroom discussion. It belongs beside the swim lanes of finance and legal in terms of bubbling up risk to an organization level. We've got some roles and responsibilities in the back of the Special Pub 839, a companion to RMF. And finally, once you know your baseline, everybody thinks they're high, right? Oh, yes, this is very important. It's a high. They see the number of controls in that required baseline, and they backpedal pretty quick. Oh, no. We're moderate, right? Because the
I see that all the time. It's like, oh, I'm not high anymore. I'm low. I'm medium, because that's a lot of work to be high.
Oh, you flipped pretty quickly there. Interesting. Yeah, let's keep talking, right? So I think we'll dive more into it. I guess the next part is purple in terms of risk assessment. So, of course, I like one of the things in Special Pub 830 is that it gives me that menu of what could go wrong to consider in threat modeling the thing. Certainly that's not comprehensive for threat modeling, but it's a great resource. And when we're talking about design, this idea of secure by design, shift left, bake it in, don't bolt it on, that's not new, right? Ron Ross had his special publication out not too long ago, or actually it was a while ago. Secure by design with CISA, I think was from 2023. And yeah, I think that's my first impression of the design phase. What I miss, what I get right, what I get wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you've done a great deep dive in how to link these things together, right? And being able to try to implement CSMRC or CSRMC, excuse me,
RMC, I know, right? We got to get used
without
to that.
without actually having the document to go with it, right? And I think that's one of the big things of why they put out that one pager like they did, where even if you look at the one pager, it has, here's our 5 phases, but she maps up with these RMF phases, steps, right? So I think an RMF really went away from what I can see in the CSRMC.
Right.
But we've now added to it with this idea of the continuous monitoring and the continuous hardening and the ability to use automated tools and DevSecOps and all that good modern stuff that didn't exist 21 years ago when RMF was written. And so RMF was really built as a tool of the time and the tool of the technologies we had at the time versus what we have today. But I do like the way you kind of link this out through all of the FIPS publications and the NIST publications to kind of help link where we should be thinking about this.
Yeah, and then I think in doing this work over the years, one of the interesting insights is you don't want to get analysis paralysis at this phase, right? Like,
yeah.
I'd started down this journey and kind of tripped and fell and walked away, and then I kind of learned, do it quickly and then move on to implement, because that is where a lot of the real work is, and time and cost and energy. So that brings us to this next piece. And when I see this, in addition to it being a more material, big piece of work, tailoring and implementing the controls to meet the security objectives, the biggest thing that stands out is this idea of continuous monitoring. And like you say, that's maybe the biggest message in the headlines is be more continuous. That's certainly what you started with. I want to show you this timeline and see what you think about it, that it's not a new concept, but certainly the effectiveness of implementing it is so hard, right? You were ripping pretty hard on, the bureaucratic static audits, but I mean, it's a challenge. Balancing audit and compliance efficiency with precision and accuracy. How much do you want me in your hair? Okay. And how much data is there and how much complexity is there? And how am I going to get comfort around that, right? So going back maybe a decade or so, we sure saw this in accounting, this idea of data-driven risk management is like, well, instead of sampling your transactions in the general ledger, can you do all of them, right? And you can now in 2011, but still having a hard time with unstructured data. But anyways, I guess my point here is that the word was written down, be data-driven, be continuous, far back a long way, but it was more like theoretical, and then how do I put it into practice is the challenge. And then, evolving, so CISA had a continuous diagnostics and mitigation program starting in 2012. Here's a recent snapshot. Get your telemetry and put it up in a dashboard. Great. We had continuous monitoring added to our control dictionary, 853. Zero Trust even gave CDM, continuous diagnostics and mitigation, a shout out in its 5 pillars. FedRAMP 20X, OSCAL, reform, right? Like, I guess the point here is that we wanted to be doing this for a long time, but we've had implementation challenges. We kept getting hit, which is why we still need to do this work, and the requirements are evolving here. Anyways, like I won't unpack each point, but what are your thoughts in terms of like why we've struggled to implement it to the point where in 2025 the Department of War said no, throw it out, start fresh. We got to do better.
Well, I think the big thing with RMF is that RMF has always been built as this checklist type environment, right? I think of it like an audit, right? I know you come from an accounting background, right? And so, if I give you an audit of my taxes, or I do my taxes, that's a once a year thing. If I asked you on September 23rd, what is my tax bill this year? You don't know, right? You don't know until January 1st when you run all the taxes and you have all the receipts and everything else. And that's how RMF was built from the ground up. It was always as a checkpoint in time. And this made sense based on the way our systems were when it was developed. I mean, if you think back to when RMF came out, if it was 21 years ago, that makes it 2004. In 2004, people were still using dial-up internet. Most homes didn't have always-on internet connections, right? And so if you think about that in the DoD context as well, a lot of their things didn't have that standard internet that was always on all the time. And even if they did, we had a single point of presence where we had boundary defense. And so like, well, you know what? If I know that, I'll use the Navy as an example. This ship got an ATO, an authorization to operate. We know its network is good, but it has one connection in and out of the ship. And that goes to a shoreside connection, to a network operating center or a NOC. And I used to run these NOCs as well. And at the NOC, we did all the firewall. We did all the defense. We did the IDS, the intrusion detection and intrusion protection system. We actually got their email. And when the ship wanted the email, they'd connect to us and basically download it, and then they would disconnect again. Because that's how these things happen. They weren't always on all the time unless you were an aircraft carrier, because satellite internet was really expensive back then. Fast forward today, and I have a satellite internet terminal with me right now. No matter where I am in the world, I pull it out, and for $165 a month, I've got, 250 megs per second going up and down for one person by myself. When I was on a ship back in 2006 and 2007, I had 3,000 people that I had to support over a 1.5 megabit per second satellite connection, right? So like the idea of always on internet just didn't exist. So your risk level was much, much smaller. But today, high-speed connections, bots everywhere, AI attackers, continuous adversaries, you have to have something that can keep up with that. And that's why RMF really had to have the shift. And like I said, my team in the Navy, we recognized this as early as 2015 and got the order out in 2017 that said, we need to do this, because we were tired of waiting for what we called then the Department of Defense, now the Department of War, to give us guidance across all the services. And having worked on the policy side in the Department of Defense, now the Department of War, I will tell you that we are very slow to implement policies and roll out like this. This CSRMC probably has been in development for 2 or 3 years before we even got this one pager, right?
Oh, interesting.
Or, is my guess, right? Again, I've been at and the government side for a couple of years now, but based on my experience, that's what I've usually seen. Now, the only thing that makes me say maybe they're going a little faster this time is because they haven't released the full document, right? They said, oh, here's our one pager, go implement, right? That takes a lot less time than the framework. But generally, we'll come up with a framework, we'll come up with an idea, and let's say it's the DoD or DOW that comes up with it. They then have to push it down to NSA, U.S. Cyber Command, and Joint Forces Headquarters DoD, which is the Department of Defense Information Network, which, funny enough, is still called the DoD, not the DOIN. They haven't changed that to Department of War, which is the network and the ISP for the entire military, right? And then from there, they go down to the services, the Air, the Marines, the Army, the Navy, and the Coast Guard gets added to, even though they're not part of Department of War, but they still get added because they're still legacy service that way. And then from there, they go down, I'll use the Navy as an example, to all of their fleet commanders to get their input. And so we talk about this like stakeholder buy-in. It goes from up here all the way down and then all the way back up. And so as it goes down, everybody tasks it down. And like if I put out the order here on Monday, it may take a week before it gets down to the guy on the bottom. And then the guy on the bottom has usually a week or two to review and comment. And then it goes up to the next level. They've got a week or two to review and comment and take all those bottom comments up, and then they go up, and it keeps going up a level like rusting nesting dolls, right? And so by the time you put out an order and get it back, it can be 2, 3, 4 months for the first draft. Then the guy at the top goes, oh, based on all those comments, let me accept or reject those, go through all of it again, and then push it out again. And so we might have 3 or 4 rounds of that, which can take a year to get that final order done that we want. And that's why the Department of War is so slow at getting things done, just because they're so large. If you look at the U.S. Navy, for example, it's 1-2 million people, right? So it's a huge organization to get all those stakeholders, and that's just one of the 5 services. And so, when you think about trying to get that many stakeholders involved, we've all worked on projects in high school and college, even at work, right? And, Amazon has a rule. They have the 2 pizza rule, right? If you have a bigger team than you can feed with 2 pizzas, the team's too big. Well, the Department of Defense, if they wanted to feed everybody who's involved, it would take, 20 pizza shops, not just 2 pizza boxes, right? And so because of that, it just slows down the whole process.
Well, I think, and there's so much insight and benefit the commercial industry gets from these challenges that are worked through in government, right? I mean, we certainly have our stakeholder engagement challenges and communication challenges with thousands of people, 10,000s of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people is really big. And I think that's what's so helpful, even if you're not in federal or at supply chain directly, to learn from NIST guidance and get the benefit of the improvements that are made here, because it's free, it's accessible, and it's proven in the big leagues. All right. Well, you also
on another side note, right? Who writes these things? Usually it's NIST, right? Is usually who will write the final documentation. This one may just be a Department of War guidance, right? But because they're the ones who are spearheading this effort, whereas RMF is written by NIST, that's 2 different organizations as well. So we could, especially under the current political climate and administration we have, see that RMF doesn't go away. And it stays there because NIST wrote it and NIST is going to keep it. And Department of War comes out with their own and says, we're not even going to play with NIST anymore. We're going to do our own thing, right? And then on top of that, we currently in the middle of a government shutdown as you and I are talking. It's been shut down for a week, and right now there's no clear end in sight, which means NIST is currently offline. They're not doing anything because they're not essential government workers. Department of War is, but even the Department of War, a lot of their workforce is contractors. A lot of them are government civilians. And unless they are considered what we call essential government employees or essential government workers, they're off right now without pay. And so, we're basically at a big pause, and this thing is not going to continue to develop because the people who are working on this are not considered essential workers. The essential workers in the government is going to be the military warfighters, the guys and gals in uniform, and the intelligence community. That's pretty much who gets to stay when a government shutdown happens. And I know this because I was working at the National Security Agency when the last government shutdown in 2018, 2019 happened, and I saw this firsthand. When I walked into work, 70% of my colleagues were not there anymore. All the guys in suits and dresses, they were not there anymore because they were not essential government workers, right? Now a lot were kept there, right? We had 30% that were kept there to keep the mission and lights on, but we definitely lost a lot of this kind of stuff. They say that's not important enough to keep paying these people or keep making them work without pay because that's what happens during a government shutdown. And so the ball pauses, and that getting that back up and running again is going to take time, right? And so I would not be surprised if it's another 3 or 6 months before we see the final product with all the documents and the full book of how to implement this.
Yeah, well, I think even when you get the book, there's a lot that we need to do to get up to speed and be ready to hit the ground running. I'll show you that. You also anticipated, I've got a question kind of DODIN, DODIN related. So we'll keep going. In the assess phase, I want to show more specifically what this information security continuous monitoring really is. I think that's what stands out to me the most, and it also resonates most with your comments so far about continuous assessment. How can we do that? I had one minor question.
Yeah.
IOC versus FOC, right? I think you just touched on initial ATO versus real ATO or something like that. Do you have a sense of what IOC versus FOC is?
Yeah, so when we start something, IOC basically is that build phase. It's like we are ready to get this thing going. A great example of this is back in 2012, 2013, there was an order that said we are going to create what we call cyber protection teams, cyber mission teams, and there's another team as well. I'm blanking on the name, but there's 3 basically teams of cyber experts, right? It's like we're losing this cyber war. We need to get this going. And so in 2012, 2013, there was an order that said we're going to fund this, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And we want the Navy to field X amount of teams, the Army to field X amount of teams. And I'll use the cyber protection teams as an example because I oversaw a lot of those folks. To get to IOC, we said you had to have the people hired. You had to have them trained to this level. They needed these certifications, these amount of classes and training. They need to do these many drills, and they need to prove that they had this basic skills competency, right? And then to get to FOC, they actually had to do all of that. Plus, they had to have the full manning, the full number of people they needed, and they needed to go on X amount of missions and prove and pass some assessments and tests in the field of showing that they can do the work, right? I think that like you've got your learner's permit, and now you can drive with somebody kind of overlooking your shoulder. And now you can really drive because you've got, your full license and you can go out at nights and weekends and whatever else you want. In Florida, where I'm from, when I grew up, you can get your driver's license, but when you got it for the first 6 months, you can only drive during the day, during light hours, by yourself. And then to become full, once you hit like 17, then you could drive overnight. There was no restrictions. You could be out at 3 a.m. if you wanted to, et cetera. So that was your IOC. You got some capability. You could drive the car around, but we don't trust you enough to do it at night yet. And then you have your FOC. You can drive anytime you want. You're a full licensed driver, just like Steve and I are today. And that's kind of the idea of initial versus full. And so as you see here, when we go into step 3, we're at that test, which is FOC. We've now built the systems. We know how to use the systems. We've documented the systems. We have the people to run those systems. Now we're at full operating capacity. Omni-Domni. Your system is now connected. You can now do the continuous monitoring, and you can make sure you're doing your penetration tests, your vulnerability assessments, getting your automated test reports in place, all that stuff, because all that stuff takes time to do, right? I need to buy those systems. I need to connect those systems, thinking about something like an automated test report. I need to hire those outside pen testers or bring in outside pen testers from the NSA, from their red team or something like that. All those things take time to get there. So we go initial and then we go into full.
Very cool. Okay. And I'm familiar with that driver's license system, and I think up here in Canada, we might call this GATES or something like that. So that's helpful to understand. Now we're getting into ISCM, and I think this is such a hot topic in GRC, and it comes from 2011, but there's a lot more modern technology to use. So I think an easy example right now is like cloud security posture management. But I've got my controls from the control dictionary 153. They're in my list. I'm constantly comparing actual state and desired state. And when there's a gap, I've got a deficiency that I need a POAM for, a plan of action to milestones, or some sort of remediation action. And how frequently can you check? Well, let's just look at one quick example. So this is from 2011. If I go to 2025 to something as simple, like this isn't even all of cloud security posture management, it's just a components of it, AWS config, right? So I've got these rules set up that says to delete an S3 bucket, you need MFA. All right, that way if a threat actor comes in, they can't just destroy everything. We got an extra layer. Or I don't want any EC2 instances that are public facing, no public IP. Every day it checks against my rules and tells me what's not compliant. And now I can, when I see that EC2 instance with a public IP, I can stop it, remediate it, spin up a new one that's private, right? It's like, if we could do that in all 106 subcategories of the cybersecurity framework, right? Like it's not always this easy, but I think that's the kind of the spirit of what I'm trying to do across my security controls. The challenge is, yikes, how am I going to do that? Where am I going to do that? Okay, but we get this, we have different sensors and telemetry collectors in our environment. And from the incident responder perspective, the security operations perspective, I guess going into a SIM, and they might even have SOAR for automated playbooks, right? But I've got the detection of anomalies, and it spins up a ticket in a security incident, and I investigate. Or on the GRC side, more like passive, not for immediate threats, but just on a continuous security control assessment basis, we can have automation to, like I just showed, to show that controls are designed and operating effectively. But I think it's just such a big topic, right? You've got EMAS in the government, you've got these commercial offerings for GRC type tools. The modern SOC, right, is so complex. We've got all of this technology going on. Like it's no wonder we're having challenges getting everything nicely into a dashboard when everything is so big and complex. So I don't know, Jason, like how far have we come? How far do we need to go? What do you want to see changing going forward to be doing this continuous assessment in a better way and more aligned to what this CSRMC is all about?
Yeah, I think we've come a long, long way, especially since the time I was working in government, right? Because what you just showed with AWS is a great example of that, right? Commercial providers have been doing this for probably 10 years now. It's been 2014, 2015, somewhere around there, that AWS really started having those abilities for you to be able to check your systems every day. I mean, even when you think about when you launch an EC2 instance, right, it's continuously checking its health. And if it gets unhealthy, it will launch a new instance and kill itself, right? And add the new instance and then take off the old instance. And that didn't really exist in the government for a long, long time because we were running our own data centers on premise, right? And we didn't have the most up-to-date technology. And that goes back to the way that government procures things in general, right? We buy things and then we put them under contract and then they get delivered 12, 18, 24 months later, right? And so the ability to have these things that are checked continuously, and AWS is a great example. AWS and Azure do this all the time. They're checking those instances to see if they're still healthy or not and if they need to go away. They're doing vulnerability scans. You could set it up where it's doing it every hour or every day or every week or whatever you want. And be able to continuously have that. When I was working in the government, the requirement was once a month you did a vulnerability scan, right? That's a huge gap in capability there of knowledge in your, because your SIEM is only as good as the data going into it, right? And so if I'm only giving it data once a month and then I'm working for a month to clear up that POAM, what about the other 29 days in that cycle, that thing from the day I scanned, right? And we were talking about this with penetration tests, they're a snapshot in time. Well, vulnerability assessments were a snapshot in time too. And now we have the capability where you can basically run vulnerability scans across your network every day if you want to and update what's going on and are the things being patched. And there's a lot of this self-healing that happens based on SORMs as well and the SOAR architecture. So I think we're much better today than we were 10 years ago because of the technology we have. The difficulty is while we're better, so are the bad guys and gals, right? Because they have this automation technology and it's so inexpensive to run large scale swaths of the internet. When I was working with the military, we had a company come in and try to sell us a product that essentially gave us the results of an outside in look of our network, of what does the internet see us as.
There's a whole host of companies that provide a service like that.
Yeah, and this was brand new back in 2016, 2017, right?
Oh, yeah,
and basically every day they were scanning the entire internet and giving us a report going, here's your vulnerabilities, here's your vulnerabilities, here's your vulnerabilities. But you can give it to me every day, but if my team can't fix it except once a week or once a month, which is more likely once a month, by the time we get it and disseminate our subordinates, because we have 1 million endpoints all spread out all over the world, it really didn't help that every day, right? Because by the time we knew it and saw it, and it wasn't an automated SOC integration SOAR type SIEM capability.
And you're assuming that it's a perfect report and that it's of meaningful risk. Like, what you gave me a B-. Well, is it really a B-? Is it a false positive? Right? How much? So one, it's hard enough if it was a perfect report. Two, there's flaws in the report.
Yeah, and that's a great point because I've been doing a lot of coding recently, and I ran a scan against my code base. I did a stack analysis last night, and it came back and goes, "Oh, I'm running a Next.js 15 application, which we don't like to use APIs for that. We use server actions as an example. And if we're not programmers in the audience, that's okay. Just get the idea. There's these two things, right?
Went over my head, yeah.
And the new ways, which is server actions, right? And it's like, oh, well, you can't use APIs, no APIs at all, right? Is what they're saying. Well, the thing I was building was a feed into an AI connector. Well, AI connectors have long data streams, right? Sometimes up to 5 minutes. Well, server actions can only support 10 to 15 seconds. And so we say it's or 7 APIs that should be server action. Check again, AI tool. You can't do server actions for this use case.
Doesn't even work, yeah.
Oh, you're right. That's a beta feature. It's not a production feature. You're right. You should be using APIs. But it's that human in the loop that had to go, you're wrong, AI. You can't do that, right? And it's the same thing with vulnerability scanning tools. How many times have we seen false positives? They're all over the place, right? And every time they're giving you another data set every day, you're like, oh, crap, now I got to figure out what's false positive again. That's a lot of work and a lot of human power there. So,
we're using...
we're not there yet.
Oh, that's okay. Right. So one, is the report good? Two, do I have the staff to deal with it? Three, do I want EPSS 3.1 or 4.0? Sorry, CVSS, or do I want EPSS or I want something else, or do we need something better? Like it's hard. Now, that's just vulnerability management. Okay, yep. That is like RAO1 or RAO5 of a long list. It's one of your 106 subcategories in CSF. Cloud security posture management stuff in security hibernatives config, that's going to be easier. But, governance was elevated with CSF 2.0, and there's a lot of governance things that are not internet connected at all. Okay, I got to continuously monitor those. There's a lot of breadth and complexity and challenge, and so I think it's a good mission, and it's going to be a long journey to get there. Okay, well, I think that brings us into getting a little bit more into maybe GRC tools and also this idea of a CSSP. So we're in the Authorize phase now, and it says CSSP everywhere, right? So I guess then, I didn't know what that meant. I hadn't seen that term.
Oh, so CSSP is a Department of Defense or now Department of War term. And this was a change from the old days of what we used to call a NOC or a SOC, but a CSSP just means a cybersecurity service provider. So I'll give you an example. In the Navy, we have one CSSP, right? It used to be known as NCDOC. I think it still is, but I'm a little outdated on my Navy terminology. But essentially, it's one organization that was sitting in Suffolk, Virginia, just outside of Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and they are the CSSP entire Navy. And now they have a couple of smaller ones that feed into them. For example, I used to work at the Network Operations Center in Bahrain, and I used to work at the Network Operations Center in Naples, Italy. And in those positions, I was in charge of all of the Middle East, and I was in charge of all of Europe. And they fed back into the global cybersecurity service provider for the Navy, which is in Virginia, and they would have all of the regions feed back to them. So they're responsible for the firewalls, the configuration, the IDS, the IPS, et cetera. And they would do all the detection for the Navy and then say, hey, you guys in Bahrain, we see there's a vulnerability on XYZ endpoint. go attack and fix, right? And they say, here's the logs. And then we look at it and go, actually, no, that event, here's why, because we know our network and you don't, right? But they would basically do the monitoring and scanning and then come back to us. So just think about them as a SOC, right? It's a global SOC,
Sure.
essentially. In the Air Force, they've got multiple. In the Army, they have multiple, but the Navy had one consolidated one.
Oh, got it. Yeah, like I think Googling, it said there's 23 of them, but there isn't a list of them on the public internet. Now it's saying this term, a next-gen CSSP risk management, not platform, but performs risk review, validates critical controls, and mandatory artifacts. That's interesting. Like, I'm torn now. Like, are they talking about that organization using EMAS or GRC tool, or are they talking about its SOC and its SIM and its SOAR, right? Like, what do you think the next-gen CSSP risk management platform is? No, it's not platform though. It's performs. Perform reviews. So what's going on here?
When they talk about next gen, so one of the things we were working on when I was, late 2018, 2020 timeframe is we were doing a consolidation from each service, being Army, Navy, Marines, etc., had their own CSSPs, and they were all using different tools, whatever they wanted. So you might be using Palo Alto, I might be using Juniper, right? And it didn't matter because we each chose our own. Well, back around that time, we were trying to consolidate it into something we called JRSS, which is basically a joint network stack. And so everybody will be using the same tools, whether that's, we're all using Palo Alto, we're all using Cisco, whatever it is.
Yep.
With same stack. That way, the data could be transferred across. And then my guess is, and again, I've been out of the military now for the military world for a couple of years. But when we say next gen, it's like that's the next version, right? So we went from version 1 to version 2 while I was there. We may be on version 3 or 4 now. I don't know. But next gen would just be we're on version 5, right? If we go from the F-18 to the F-35, that's the next gen plane,
yep.
Right? So I think that's all they're talking about is like, this is the new technology stack, and this new technology stack is going to be better. It's going to have more stuff. It's going to have more capability, and it can do it at a higher capacity or faster. Because I will tell you, one of the biggest problems that we've had in the military structure for decades is the amount of data we're putting in these systems. And that becomes a bottleneck, right? How many packets can a firewall look at? Especially when you have traffic from 5 million endpoints all going through it, right? I mean, when you think about something like the National Security Agency, they're looking at every DoD network, DOW network, Department of War network out there, an endpoint. That is a lot of data, right? Which is why they have that huge server farm out there that just does nothing but processing data. And that becomes choke points. And so the next gen, it probably went from where we could do 1 gig per second to 10 gigs per second, or 10 gigs to 100 gigs, or whatever that number happens to be. I don't know their specifications, and if I did, I would be able to talk about it in this forum anyway. But that's what they mean by next gen. This is the better system. It's going from Windows 10 to Windows 11, right? Or whatever that happens to be.
I gotcha. Well, that's fascinating to think of the scale of that tech stack and the multiple organizations using them. How do they perform risk review and validate critical controls and mandatory artifacts? Like, obviously, with your regular package for authority to operate, there's vulnerability scan and POAM packages. Are they doing that all in the EMAS? I don't know. Any thoughts on the risk review process and how that works and kind of where it's going, how you see it evolving?
Yeah. So the thing I like about this, when I saw this, is that they're taking that CNA piece, that certification and accreditation piece, away from the paper pushers and bring it into the people who have to defend it, right? And before that was not the case. The CSSP had no say in whether or not that network was connected, right? It was done by a different organization. That's what we call the CAO, or the Certification Authorization Authority or organization. And the CAA is the person who does it. And they would look at all your documentation. It's basically this, you're basically writing a book of 300 or 400 pages going, here's my plan, here's my risk, here's my vulnerabilities, and here's my POAM. And as long as they weren't high, if they were mediums and lows, I could get approval and connect it to the network. Well, now, before you send it to those folks, you got to send it through your CSSP. And the CSSP is going to look at it because they're going to be responsible for defending it, right? And this is the problem when I worked as a CSSP is, I'm responsible for defending Steve's network. But Joe over there is the one who says Steve can connect the network. I never got to look at it. And now it's being connected, and I didn't even know it was being connected. And I'm like, what's this new network over here that I'm trying to defend? And I don't even know what it is. Now I get to look at it first and go, oh, actually, Steve, you're using Windows 10 on this system. That's not supported after October of this year, which is, I think like tomorrow it goes end of life. So no, you can't connect this anymore. You got to go upgrade Windows for me. Before, that wasn't the case, right? Instead of operation people. So this, I think, is one of those steps of trying to make this a more operational framework and give us more security than just saying it's a paperwork drill, which is what it was before a lot of the time.
Awesome. Well, man, that is so great to get your perspective of actually doing this stuff as an outsider looking in, right? Okay, and now we've got the last one. It's about continuous monitoring, ConMon. Not a new term, but certainly new technology and gear to do it. Again, it's pointing to this idea from 2011 of continuous monitoring. You know what's, how do you do this well? Like, what does good look like to you when we get into continuous monitoring and just generally the RMF's monitoring phase or now the operations phase?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be the hard one, right? Because in the old days, as I mentioned earlier, right, we had an IATO that was good for 12 months. We had an ATO that was good for 36 months or 3 years. Now we're going to have this continuous ATO. So essentially, when you put in your package, part of that is going to say, here's how I'm going to do my monitoring, right? It's going to be done by CSSP, and they're going to be looking at this, 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 and this. That's what you're going to be judged against. And so if you start getting out of baseline, you'll have a certain amount of time to get back in baseline, or they'll disconnect you and pull you off the network. Now, I'll tell you, we say this a lot in documents. When it comes down to the reality of it, will we pull somebody off the network? Yes, we have. But we really think it through before we do it, right? Because you have to think about, okay, there's this ship and they're out in the Persian Gulf and they're firing missiles into Iraq and Afghanistan during the war. Would you want to disconnect a ship that's in the middle of a war because of a cybersecurity vulnerability? Well, maybe not. Depends on how vulnerable they are, right? And so maybe you start putting them into an isolated enclave instead so they can still do their mission, but they can't talk to the other ships, or they can't connect to the internet at large, and they stay on their secret network, but not their unclassified network. There's decisions you have to make. But, in the paper, we just say, oh, you're out of baseline, let's disconnect you, right? That may work in commercial land, but it's not going to work in military warfighter land.
It doesn't work in commercial, man, right? We got to balance, protect, and enable. And there's, there are multiple risks to the business, and you'll be out of a job pretty fast if you're the office of the CISNO, right? So
yeah, I mean, can I take Steve's computer offline? Yes. Can I take all the
that's right.
off the Target on Christmas Day? No, right? We'll wait till the next day and take them offline on the weekend, right? And we've
100%, and we've got the BIAs to back it up.
Yeah, I was on one where we had an issue and a foreign adversary broke into a network, and it was literally like before Father's Day weekend. And it was inside of a network that was a retail store. And like, look, you guys are really screwed here. They're in there, they're taking everything. And they go, yeah, but our biggest sales day of the year is Father's Day. We can't take it down this weekend. You've got to keep it up. And so we, over that 4 days, we basically did all the planning, got everything staged. And as soon as Father's Day was over, they closed the store at 6 p.m. We went offline, fixed everything. We took them offline for a day and a half. They were closed, and then we brought them back online. Now, is that ideal? No, but at least we didn't take them off when we wanted to and cost them their biggest sales day of the year, right? So those are those operational things to think about. But you're right? When we look at this from a monitoring perspective, we got to know what to monitor, how we're going to monitor it, where that data is going, who's actually doing the monitoring. Because I see this so much where people will set up all this stuff, especially in the military, because it's built by contractors and outsourced companies. They'll have a perfect system and all this data being collected. But nobody ever funded the people in the military to actually monitor that data. So when the contractor turns on the system and all that data is going into a system, who's looking at it? Who's making sure that monitoring is happening so we can decide, is this still authority to operate, or do we need to rescind that authority to operate based on the automated risk assessments and making sure we have that continuous authority to operate based on our current posture, not the posture we had when we installed the system 2 years ago.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jason. I think, so we've hit all the steps. That's been very helpful to wrap my head around this change. I think maybe like lightning round, there's one or two other things I just wanted to get your knee-jerk reaction to, okay?
Sure.
So one thing that I thought I would see more of, now we've only got 2 pages and a press release to work with, but this idea of like, I didn't see it directly in the guidance yet, but this idea of like GRC engineering, compliance as code, policy as code, security as code. NIST has used that term. DevSecOps, modern CI/CD. We did touch on kind of like automated software development and continuous integration, continuous deployment. How much of this comes to mind when we're talking about authority to operate and we're talking about this, the types of systems going through this process?
Yeah, I think this is all going to have to be done. I think the reason it's not what we see is because it's only a 2-page document. We have two-page documents that are very similar, and they're very high level. Like, here's the steps, right? Here's where we're going. Here's our road. We're going to go from Toronto to Miami, but we don't know how we're going to get there yet, right? Which roads are we going to take? We haven't figured that out, right? And then we're going to fill in those details. I think this is the way we do things, but what we saw so far is the policy of what needs to be done, the what, but not the how. And so when we start talking about GRC engineering, security as code, building out modern CI/CD pipe, that is the how we're going to do it. How are we going to make sure these things are secure before they're fielded? Well, that's where the modern CI/CD line goes. And I think that's one of the big things with this RM they're trying to get to is faster deployment cycles. Because I will tell you, having gone through the ATO, the traditional ATO process numerous times, 12 to 24 months to get that approval. Back when I was a young Navy officer and we were doing a collaborative environment, we had to bring in 200 partner nation foreign nationals onto our ship and provide internet access for this big exercise we were doing. Well, the problem is they're foreign national. They can't be on our network, right? Because our network is for U.S. personnel only because there's stuff on there we don't want other people to see, right?
You know, no foreign clause in the contract. I gotcha. Exactly,
right? And so we decided, okay, we've got guys till it kicks off. So me and my team, we designed our network. We built an enclave. We built up the server work, right? And we did not hear back from the CAOs, the certification authority, within that 9 months. Well,
brutal.
Once we leave port, back then, the CO, the captain of the ship, has the authority to say yes or no on his own. When you're tied to the pier, certification authority still has a permission. But as soon as you leave the ship, the pier, back in these days, the captain gets to make the decision. So I went up to the captain and said, hey, here's what we need to do. We're picking up these in 5 days. Do you want us to turn on this network? He goes, yes, I do. So we went and turned on the network. Did the exercise. Everything went well. Everything was secure. My team and I did what we needed to do. Exercise finishes. 9 months later, we get a message that goes, your network is now approved for use.
Oh, no.
At that point, we'd already part of the system. We'd already been decommissioned. That's how long it took, right? It was twice as long as we needed. And that's what they're trying to do is get this into a faster way, right? Nowadays, we can spin up cloud servers and blah, blah, blah. Just because we have the technology to build it fast doesn't mean we have the approval to connect it. And I think that's why, with the modern CI/CD pipelines, how do you integrate that into this old world system of security and authorization, as opposed to just spinning up a new VM and going, up, I've got a new server on the network that nobody knows about. And that's one of the continuous monitoring and continuous ATO process.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Man, there's so much more we could cover, but I think we've hit time. Do you have any final messages or thoughts, to help me or even to help viewers in the Simply Cyber community when it comes to, this change and what it means to our jobs and to searching for jobs?
Yeah, I think it's really important to know this exists and understand it. If your company were using RMF, it's probably not going to affect you much, right? But if you are using RMF, it will definitely affect you because you're going to be going through a lot of action over the next 12 to 18 months as this rolls out with more details. I know us here at AKYLADE, we're looking at this very closely as well and tracking it because, as you know, Steve, 2 of our certifications are on risk, right? We have the AKYLADE certified risk management fundamentals, and both of those do cover RMF. In fact, in practitioner, there's an entire domain that is dedicated to the 7 steps of the RMF. When we have more details on CSRMC, we're going to have to go back and redo that exam and make sure that it is up to date with the latest. And so when we go into version 2, which will probably be next year now based on this coming out, we're going to have to go and dive deep in RMF being replaced. Or is this in addition to RMF? We don't know that yet. Because right now we see that CSRMC maps directly to RMF, but are they going to say, well, now this is going to supersede it, and NIST is going to take it over and run it? We don't have those details yet. So as soon as we do, we'll be able to go into that. As job seekers, I think it's important to know this exists, especially here in the U.S. A lot of cybersecurity jobs are tied to the government and specifically the Department of War. So knowing that this exists and being able to speak to it is really important. You may hear interview questions now. So there's, what's new in cybersecurity? One of the typical questions that one of my hiring manager friends likes to ask is, so what's been come out in the last month in cybersecurity, right? And you could say, oh, there was this new thing called CSRMC, and it maps to RMF, and it's really focused on continuous monitoring and hardening because that's a big difference than what we did before. And if you can kind of have that 30-second soundbite about that, you're going to impress the hiring manager because you're up to date and keeping up to date with the news. And if you obviously are. Good, Steve.
Well, I'd be impressed if they said indicator of compromise is actually not the first IOC. So
right.
Thanks for that insight and all the other ones today, Jason. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, man.